that Pakistan was helping Taliban. Could you please share your thoughts in this regard on how far it's true?
If Pakistan helped Taliban win against the United States, it means that Pakistan is stronger than the United States, the whole of the Europeans, and so strong that it has been able to make a lightly armed militia, 65, 60, 70,000 militia, beat a well-equipped army of 300,000. So it is, unfortunately, it is a propaganda which has been unleashed, number one, by the Afghan government to cover up its incompetence, its corruption, its inability to give governance proper governance to Afghanistan, it being perceived as a puppet government, not being respected by the people of Afghanistan. And secondly, it's India, which invested heavily in this Ghani Afghan government. And so this propaganda comes from there, but it has no logic. It is not possible. Pakistan total budget, the total budget for 220 million people is $50 billion. How could it have in any way supported insurgency in Afghanistan, which overwhelmed the United States, which spent over $2 trillion in Afghanistan in 20 years. So it is just not logical, it is propaganda. And how come the 300,000 Afghan army did not fight? Did Pakistan ask them not to fight? So if you want to know the reasons why the Taliban won and the Americans finally lost after 20 years, all you have to do is do a detailed analysis of why one of the most bravest nations in the world, the Afghan nation, why did the army give up without a fight?
Your Excellency, you said that you won't recognize new government in Afghanistan until the international community will not recognize them. Would you please say, are you planning to recognize this new government at all?
Pakistan is part of an international community. The recognition of Afghanistan is going to be very significant, the Taliban government. And what we are doing is that we are working with all the neighbors of Afghanistan. We are developing a policy, what should the Taliban government do for all of us to recognize them. And clearly, the thing that comes out most significantly is that the Taliban government must have an inclusive government, because Afghanistan is a country of diversity. The Pashtun element, Taliban are basically a Pashtun movement, is roughly half the population. Then there are Tajiks, who are a significant minority, and then there are Uzbeks, and then there are Hazara. So for the interest of Afghanistan, for the long-term stability of Afghanistan, all of us feel that it must be an inclusive government which unites Afghanistan. So really that's where we stand today. We will discuss with all the neighbors of Afghanistan and come up with a policy.
As we all witnessed Taliban recently, we saw the announcement of the new government by Taliban, and they still didn't consider all minorities' interests and to make them represent this government as well. What do you think, considering that Talibs right now, they're considering themselves as the winners, they're victorious, and will they recognize other minorities as well in the future?
Look, the Taliban have been through one of the most, what should I say, the most epic struggles anyone could have gone through, because after 20 years they have really survived one of the greatest military machines in the history of mankind, and they have taken heavy casualties in this. So I assume what is going on right now is that there is a feeling amongst those who have struggled in these 20 years, who've given a lot of sacrifices. They would want to have the lion's share, the main share of the government. And yet, I think within the Taliban, there are people who feel that unless they get all other minorities, other sects, groups, everyone until they get them under the umbrella, they feel that the government will remain unstable. So I think that is going on within the Taliban movement right now. But from the point of view of Afghanistan, as a well-wisher of Afghanistan, I feel that the only way there will be stability, long-term peace, if it's an inclusive government.
What do you think, sir, regarding the Taliban? Can they change their ideology indeed, in reality, after 20 years when they fought for this ideology? Can they be acceptable in the eyes of the world community? Can they change something in ideology?
The Taliban fought like before them in the 19th century. The Afghans fought the British. They all, against British, it was jihad. They were fighting for freedom of the country in the name of, they used to call it a holy war. All along Pakistan's border with Afghanistan, which is called the tribal area, where there are Pashtun tribes living, they throughout 80-year interaction against the British, they fought against the British throughout the 80 years. Some part of the tribal area was up in arms against the British, and they fought under the name of jihad, because fighting against a foreign invasion is jihad. Then against the Soviets it was jihad, and it's exactly what the Taliban did this time, it's jihad. Question is now, once they come into government, what sort of government will they have? How much will they adapt? Are they still the Taliban of 20 years, or is this a different Taliban? Have they learned something? So far from the announcements that they have made, I feel that they have learned a lot in these 20 years, they have changed. But what will happen, I'm afraid I'm not in a position to say what is going to happen.
Mr. Prime Minister, did the United States of America indeed, they want the Taliban, that they won't recognize them? Did they want them indeed? What do you think?
I don't know. I have no idea.
What kind of relationships right now you have with the current administration of the United States, specifically with the new President Joe Biden?
Well, you know, my government has relationship with them. Our security chiefs keep exchanging views about the situation in Afghanistan. Our foreign minister has met their foreign secretary. So there is talk between the two countries. I'm not sure whether at the moment the United States has a coherent policy towards what they're going to do in Afghanistan. And the reason is there's so much criticism of President Biden for his decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, and which I feel is extremely unfair. I think that what President Biden did was the only sensible thing to do. But how can you prepare? He's been criticized heavily that he wasn't prepared. But how do you prepare if 2 weeks before the date of departure, whether that date was given now, in years' time, or 6 years' time, or 5 years' time, if the Afghan government, if the president flees the country and the army collapses 2 weeks before the departure, how can you prepare for that? So there is a lot of unfair criticism, I'm afraid, of Joe Biden. And because of that, I think and then the inquisition of their foreign secretary in front of Senate. So I don't think they have still formulated a rational policy because of the sheer amount of criticism, unfair criticism which they are facing. But I think sooner or later, the US has to decide that unless Afghanistan stabilizes, and unless this huge humanitarian crisis is averted by helping this government, or forget the government, the people of Afghanistan, unless the people of Afghanistan are helped and stabilized, the situation stabilizes, If this descends into a huge humanitarian crisis, which it will go if the international community does not help, then the consequences would be far-reaching in terms of refugees. There'll be a huge refugee problem, which Pakistan probably will face more, Iran, two countries which have had taken the most number of Afghan refugees. We still have almost 3 million Afghan refugees. But it will also have on terrorism, that if there is instability in Afghanistan, then how will the government be able to stop terrorism from Afghan soil? And there again, Pakistan is worried because there are already 3 different groups that have been operated from Afghan soil hitting Pakistan.
But the thing that happened in Kabul International Airport is the clear evidence that there is still a terrorism in place. Because those terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS and others might even get stronger in this situation. And from your standpoint, whether it is a crucial time to unify efforts, not only Pakistan but international community, to consider these threats because there might be some harmful consequences.
There is no doubt that if there is instability, chaos, a weak government in Afghanistan which cannot control the terrorists, because a weak government will not be able to control the space for terrorists in Afghanistan. So if that happens, then the country that is going to be most at risk will be Pakistan. As I said, there are 3 different terrorist groups that have been attacking Pakistan. One is the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, because they got, when Pakistan took action against these Pakistani Taliban who are attacking the state of Pakistan, they were pushed into Afghanistan. So one is that group. Second is ISIS. ISIS has done a number of attacks inside Pakistan territory. And so if, and that ISIS is the one which did that attack on the Kabul airport. But also we have Baloch terrorists. These terrorists have been using Afghan soil to do attacks in Balochistan. And therefore, yes, it is that's why Pakistan is talking to all the neighbors of Afghanistan. We want a consensus built how we can support this current government and stabilize the situation, how we should avert this humanitarian crisis. But I think the US has a big part to play, because US was there for 20 years. And it also bears responsibility. If there's chaos in Afghanistan, if there's terrorism from the soil of Afghanistan, then we must remember that 20 years ago, the only reason the US invaded Afghanistan was because of terrorism. Al-Qaeda, which had hit the US. So if that was the reason for coming over, then 20 years later, over $2 trillion spent, 2,400 Americans dead, but hundreds of thousands of Afghans dead, 80,000 Pakistanis died in this. So what would be the achievement if, after all this time, again Afghan soil is being used for terrorism? So therefore, I think the whole world community has to take cognizance. And this is a historic moment where they should not let Afghanistan drift towards chaos and go into another crisis.
Well, of course, we all know that Pakistan has suffered more than anybody else, any other countries, because of the situation in Afghanistan that lasted many years, because Pakistan has the longest border with this country. And recently it was mentioned by your country that Pakistan is unable to receive more refugees from this country because the flood is too much. And if this trend will keep going, keep increasing, what do you think whether it's time for the international community to think about some necessary measures to be taken in order to somehow facilitate this process?
Well, you know, firstly, I was listening to the Senate hearing where Secretary Blinken was there and answering these questions to the senators. And I must say, as a Pakistani, I felt deeply hurt by some of the remarks made by those senators. to blame Pakistan for this debacle in Afghanistan is the most painful thing for us to listen to. Pakistan is the country that gave the greatest number of sacrifices for the American war in Afghanistan. Pakistan was asked to join this invasion of Afghanistan by the Americans, or become part of this coalition, when Pakistan had nothing to do with 9/11. There was no Pakistani involved in it. Al-Qaeda was in Afghanistan. There were no militant Taliban in Pakistan. We had no reason to enter the war. But unfortunately, our military dictator at the time, to get acceptability from the Americans, he took us into this war. And this war cost Pakistan, 80,000 people died in this. Because what happened was that the Mujahideen of 80s who were trained to fight jihad against the Soviets, we had trained them to fight against foreign occupation was a holy war, a jihad. And now when the Americans invaded Afghanistan, the same people we are trying to tell them now, because we had joined the Americans, we now are telling them that now fighting against the Americans is terrorism. So they turned against us. They called us collaborators. So they started doing terrorist acts against Pakistan. And then all along the border, the Pashtun tribes, which had sympathy with the Taliban, not because of their ideology, but because of their ethnicity. So the Pashtun nationalism kicked in. They too thought we were collaborators against fellow Pashtuns. And they formed what was the Pakistani Taliban. So they started attacking Pakistan as collaborators. And there were insider attacks from within the Pakistan army who had trained the Mujahideen. So there were 2 suicide attacks, failed attacks, but on General Musharraf from within the army. There were 50 different militant groups split into groups who were attacking the state of Pakistan at one point. On top of it, our ally, it's only time in history when a country is being attacked bombed by its own ally. 480 drone attacks were conducted in Pakistan by the US. So this country, what we went through, the suffering we went through, forget about the people who lost their limbs in bomb attacks, the loss to the economy, when you have suicide attacks, Islamabad was like a fortress. So the country lost over $150 billion. And after all the sacrifice, rather than a word of appreciation, because they appreciate other people, they're saying, we are worried about the Afghans who helped the coalition and who, they are trying to look after getting them to the US. But what about Pakistan? A country loses 80,000 people. Were we children of a lesser God? Didn't it matter to them? And then being made scapegoats for their failure in Afghanistan, I think was the most painful thing.
Sir, I want to ask you with regard to the Pakistani position in terms of Taliban. Do you think it is needed to talk to them and also to recognize this new government?
I think the world, the international community, they do not have a choice. Because if they do not, Taliban is a reality now, they have taken over Afghanistan. Now what are the choices left in front of the international community? I think the only one choice left is that they should incentivize them, they should encourage them to stick to the promises or announcements they have made about inclusive government, about human rights, having given amnesty to everyone. I think the world should encourage them to walk this path. And if that happens, and hopefully, if it works, you could have peace in Afghanistan after 40 years. But what if the world community decides to put sanctions on them, or what happens? It's the people of Afghanistan that are going to suffer. A country which relied until this Taliban have taken over. Until then, the Afghan government, 75% of their budget was foreign aid. If the foreign aid disappears, the country will collapse. And if it collapses, as I said, it's, apart from the humanitarian crisis, this will have implications not only for all the neighbors of Afghanistan, but I think in terms of international terrorism, it will have effect everywhere. So therefore, the only one way to go is to incentivize the Taliban to stick to what they promised of inclusive government and hope that they take that path.
Your Excellency, the Prime Minister, right now we know that Pakistan and India are members, both countries are members of SCO. How could you comment with regard to relations between two countries, two neighbors, considering this current situation and developments that we see in the region? What do you think, but how could you comment whether the peace, mutual understanding will come between these two countries, your countries?
Well, you know, Pakistan has made every effort to have peace with India. And I can tell you, because I know India very well, I have had great friendships in India. I've had a lot of love and respect because I used to play cricket, and cricket is one of the, you know, a sport that goes right to the grassroots. It's the most loved sport there. So I tried my best to have, you know, improve our relationship with India. But unfortunately, India is ruled by an ideology which is called the RSS ideology. That RSS ideology was inspired by the Nazis in the 1920s and 30s. And it's a racist ideology which actually believes that the Hindu is superior to all the other minorities. And therefore, it is a strongly anti-Pakistan, quite an aggressive ideology which, you know, which believes in subordinating not just the minorities in India, but also the neighbors around them. And so I found it very difficult to take our relationship forward. And then on 5th August in 2019, they unilaterally took away the state of Kashmir. And Kashmir is a disputed territory between Pakistan and India. And this has been recognized by the world community through United Nations Security Council resolutions. So once they did that, then that's when all our communication stopped. Because there's no way we can have normal relationship when what they're doing in Kashmir is violating every human right. The world community worries about Taliban's human rights violations. Well, what about the violations that are going on in Kashmir, where there are some 800,000 Indian troops basically keeping 8 million people, Kashmiri people, in an open prison. And every right of theirs is violated. They talk about women's rights in Afghanistan, but there are about, what, 40,000 Kashmiri women that have been raped by the security forces, and all sorts of human rights abuses. It's been, this has been well documented by the Human Rights Commissioner of the United Nations. So, unfortunately, until they go back to what taking the statehood of Kashmir on 5th August 2019, until they go back, unfortunately, we cannot resume a normal relationship with them.